Hello, everyone. Welcome back. You're listening to Perplexity, a mystery podcast. I'm your host, Kaydra. Thank you, as always, for listening. Thanks for being here. I hope you guys enjoyed the 3-part series of the I-45 murders. I released part 3 last week. If you haven't listened to that yet, definitely check it out, especially if you like true crime. That was a wild past couple of episodes. That was a long project, too. A lot of research. I worked on those episodes for probably like a month. So yeah, definitely go back and listen to those. Let me know what you guys think, and if you like more of those like series concepts for episodes, if you want more of that. As far as today goes, I'll be doing a lighter episode, something a little bit more fun, I guess you could say. It's definitely fitting in the Perplexity theme. We're going to be talking about out-of-body experiences, which are always mysterious, perplexing. So we'll get into all of that in a second. Just briefly, I wanted to mention, as always, if you like what you've been hearing on the podcast and you haven't yet, be sure to leave a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening on. Follow the podcast so that you know when new episodes are being released. You can email me any topic requests or share a story with me if you'd like me to read it on the podcast at perplexitymysterypodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Instagram for the latest Perplexity updates at Perplexity Mystery Podcast. I also just wanted to say hello to Mexico. We have some new Perplexity listeners in Mexico. So there are 9 countries now listening. That's amazing. Thank you guys so much for the support. To make sure that I have time to dive into this story, the sources for today's episode are all going to be listed in the show notes. Be sure to check those out. Trigger warning, content warning. Today's episode is going to be discussing death, near-death experiences, hallucinations, mental health difficulties, topics that just may be disturbing for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised for listeners below the age of 13. It's said that 1 in every 10 people will experience an out-of-body experience in their lifetime. Or, more commonly, that people will experience several in their lifetime. Out-of-body experiences are also called OBEs for short. The most commonly reported sensations when you're having an OBE are falling, floating, repercussions like myoclonia, which is the jerking of your limbs or jerking awake, a sinking sensation, numbness, intracranial sounds, so sounds in your head that just seem strange, tingling, clairvoyance, oscillation, and serenity. Another common sensation related to OBE is temporary or projective catalepsy, which is a more common symptom of sleep paralysis. And catalepsy is a medical condition that is basically a trance or a seizure that results in temporary loss of sensation and consciousness, and your body feels very rigid. Some studies have found that people who have OBEs are also more likely to experience sleep paralysis. Psychologists and neuroscientists tend to regard OBEs as dissociative experiences that occur along with various psychological and neurological factors. They could be induced by a TBI, a traumatic brain injury, sensory deprivation, near-death experiences or NDEs, dissociative and psychedelic drugs, dehydration, sleep disorders, dreaming, and even electrical stimulation of certain areas of the brain. So OBEs can also be deliberately induced. There's tons and tons of theories as well about why they happen, whether they could be spiritual, paranormal, scientific, psychological. But generally speaking, they can be classified in 2 ways. Spontaneous out-of-body experiences, meaning they unexpectedly happen, like when you're sleeping, or they could be induced, and that could be because of a chemical cause, a mechanical cause, like a special machine or electrode, or a mental cause. So, just to get in a little bit more detail, certain hallucinogenic drugs like psilocybin, ketamine, DMT, MDA, and LSD can cause out-of-body experiences. There's also a state that has been deemed the mind awake, body asleep state. So it's like a special kind of meditation, is what I gathered from reading about it. In fact, Thomas Edison used this mind awake, body asleep state to tackle problems while he was working on his inventions. He would rest a silver dollar on his head while sitting with a metal bucket and a chair. And as he would drift off to sleep, the coin would fall into the bucket and make a noise, restoring some of his alertness. Deliberately teetering between awake and asleep states is known to cause spontaneous trance-like episodes at the onset of sleep. And these are ultimately helpful when you're trying to have an out-of-body experience. When you're moving deeper and deeper into relaxation, you can eventually encounter that slipping kind of feeling if the mind is still alert. This slipping is reported to feel like you're leaving your physical body. So certain machines that can cause that mechanical induction of OBEs could be neuroelectrical stimulations. If the brain is directly stimulated in the vestibular cortex, or if there's stimulation in the temporoparietal junction of the brain, you can also have an out-of-body experience. Most neurologists that study out-of-body experiences tend to believe these more scientific types of theories. In the 1940s, in fact, out-of-body experiences were actually discovered through scientific research using electrical stimulation to the brain. You can also experience an out-of-body experience through sensory deprivation, like if you're using a flotation tank, or if you're playing pink noise as opposed to like white noise or brown noise through headphones. You can also experience an out-of-body experience through sensory overload. So for example, if the person is rocked back and forth for a long time, an especially designed cradle, or if they're submitted to light forms of torture, this can cause the brain to shut itself off from all sensory input. So sensory deprivation or sensory overload, either one, they can cause you to basically be confused and disoriented and have that ethereal out-of-body experience. This is also why some pilots have been known to experience out-of-body experiences, because they have strong G-forces when they're flying. So strong G-forces can cause the blood to drain from parts of your brain, causing sensory deprivation and then an out-of-body experience. Astronauts have also experienced this because of those strong G-forces. If you want to have an out-of-body experience through meditation, there are also, I don't know how valid these are, but there are some guided meditations that I found on YouTube from quote-unquote experts. I don't know their credentials, but these people tended to recommend working on being in the right mindset, like being open to the idea of having one, keeping a dream journal and recording your dreams, having a separate area beside your bed to practice having an OBE, or if you are going to use your bed, put your feet where you normally put your head. You can also do meditation work, trying to get yourself into that mind awake, body asleep state. So let's dive into some out-of-body experience stories, shall we? I'm going to kick us off by playing you guys a voice message that my mom sent me.
So this would have been in like the 1994 to 1995 time frame, and I was in bed one night and I just came out of my body. I just floated out of my body toward the ceiling and flipped over, and I could see myself looking down at myself laying in bed. And then I saw my husband sleeping next to me, and he had his hand on his head with his elbow facing my pillow. And all I could think of was, I have to get back in my body. And so I'm like reaching my hands toward my body, trying to just get back in it, get back in it. That's all I could think of. And I was reaching. And then boom, I was back in my body. And then I came gasping for air, just like that. And then I looked over and my husband's hands was in the exact same position that I saw him in when I was floating above my body. It was the craziest thing.
Okay, so my mom also emailed me, including a few more details because the voice messages are only a minute max. So she says, I will say at that time we were going through financial troubles and we were trying to provide for our little girl, Kaydra. Oh, that's me. And then she also said her OBE felt almost like she was swimming upstream in a river. And then when recalling how she felt when she went back into her body and how my dad was laying in the exact same position, she said, quote, "That's what made it so real to me. It was just a dream. How did I see my husband in the exact same position? To this day, I'll never understand what really happened. If it was just a dream, it was the most realistic dream I've ever had. I honestly think I died in that moment. For some reason, I died and came back to life. Of course, I was perfectly healthy, and there was no reason why I should have died, so my logic side says it was just a dream. But the part of me that experienced that terrifying moment says otherwise. Mom, thank you for writing that message and sending in the voice message. What a wild story." Okay, so now I'm going to read you guys a Reddit post. This is from Reddit user zombie underscore twats with a Z. Her words, not mine. She starts, quote, "I was 17, fucked up, and had taken 400 aspirin. I did try to get help beforehand, but the doctor at the psych ward said, quote, 'You're going to kill yourself anyway, so I'm letting you go.'" Wow, what an asshole. Okay, so they go on to say, "I was devastated. My guardian ad litem brought me back to my foster home. I grabbed a bunch of aspirin, went to my room, and downed them all. It was really hard to not puke it all up, but I just kept drinking water. Some I chewed to make it easier. Anyway, foster sister came home early and found me. She called 911. I went to the local ER. My aspirin levels there were only like 15 or so I drank 2 cups of charcoal and was admitted to the psych ward. Luckily, I was the only one there. I decided to take a nap. When I woke up and went to pee, I began puking, and I couldn't stop. I'd take a sip of water and puke some more. They kept making me drink more charcoal every time I puked. I don't know how long this went on, but I finally convinced them to be in there with me so I could take a shower. I was covered in black vomit. Things suddenly got worse, though. I don't remember a lot of it, but I do remember walking all over in a daze, asking what was going on. And one time I woke up in some random bed in another room. Someone told me they were transferring me by Medicopter to the next city over because this one didn't have an ICU. The ride in the Medicopter seemed like it took forever. I remember asking why it was taking so long, and the dude said something like, quote, "It seems that way, doesn't it? It's only 30 minutes. We'll be there soon, just hang tight." Probably not word for word, but anyway. We went to the ICU, and I moved to a bed. There are tons of doctors and nurses around me, or just one doctor and lots of male and female nurses. I wasn't aware enough to tell. They kept trying to ram NG tubes up my nose, and I'd rip them out. Oh God, that's awful. They tore my nose stud out, and they made my nose bleed. I kept ripping my IVs out. I think at one point, they were all surrounding me and holding me down while the NG tube was inserted. Oh my gosh. I clearly remember looking at the leaking IV I had yanked out and telling the nurses holding my arm to let me put it back in. I also remember seeing myself from a different view. I had crazy, crying eyes. I think I may have had a minor out-of-body experience then as well. I don't know how much later it was, but I woke up with both arms and legs restrained to the bed. I didn't know what was going on or why I was there. There I was, There was an IV taped to my foot. I felt something weird in my nether regions and was going to pull it out, but some instinct told me not to. It was a catheter. I was apparently awake when they put it in. Some nurse told me I held her hand while they did it. I remember nothing about that. My brain was swollen, so they put a shunt in. Oh man. My organs were failing. I had tubes coming out of me from everywhere. I wasn't allowed any food or drink, but they would wet a sponge and moisten my tongue. Yep, that was probably a tooth-out sponge. I use those at work. For those of you who don't know, I work in a hospital, so a lot of this I'm like, yep. I also kept puking, black vomit, projectile even. I shit myself too. Oh my gosh. Okay, sorry guys. If you're easily grossed out, skip ahead like 15 seconds. Explosive black diarrhea. That sounds horrific. 10 out of 10 would not recommend. Okay, so then they say, I cried when that happened. I felt like a helpless old person when they cleaned me up. After being there around 18 hours, my heart stopped. I didn't feel any pain though. I was then outside of my body, looking at the doctor and nurses, trying to start my heart back up again. They were injecting me with shit, paddling me, and doing compressions. The doctor had a bald spot on top of his head. A nurse had a ketchup/blood stain on her pant leg. I would imagine that was blood. Probably not ketchup. I didn't just float there though, I went somewhere. It was very, very cold and dark, and nobody else was there. I didn't know what was going on, but I was scared. Time stopped existing for me. I walked in this place, yelling and screaming, and trying to find another person. And then suddenly, I was yanked and flew back into my body. I felt like I had been slammed into a wall. It hurt to come back. I had been clinically dead for 2 minutes. I didn't wake up for 8 hours after that. I didn't tell the doctors about the cold place. I rarely tell people about the cold place. I did tell him about floating there. I told him what happened, who did what they were wearing, and about the bald patch on his head. He told me that it happened sometimes, and that I should see a therapist specializing in OBEs. I didn't, of course. 1 week later, I was transferred. I was there for 8 months. I got out on my 18th birthday. Wow. I was unable to take pills unless they were crushed up and put in applesauce or yogurt for years. Yeah, honey, you had dysphagia. Wow. And seeing oil/tar patches on roads made me nauseous and gave me flashbacks. Oh, because they're black and all the charcoal. Oh my gosh. My organs all healed correctly. My hair grew back from where the shunt was. Everything went back to normal for me, and that's where they end. Okay, man, that's so crazy. The other one that we're going to read has a similar vibe to it as far as like being medical related, but that sounds so terrifying. While there are thousands and thousands of stories about out-of-body experiences, I did think, though, that it would be really cool to just dive in to this incredible story that I heard a few years ago. I heard it on a podcast by Snap Judgment. It's called Spooked, and I'll put it in the show notes. But wow, if you guys have never heard this podcast before, add it to your list because it is so good. I also love to listen to it during October because it's a lot of like spooky stories. But the host basically brings different people on and they tell their stories about crazy or mysterious or creepy things that have happened to them. So the stories can range from being about ghosts, cryptids, demons, or just straight up crazy things that you can't really explain. The story that I'm going to tell you guys is from an episode on Spooked called 37 Seconds. And I absolutely love this story. The first time I heard it, I actually cried because it's such a powerful and emotional story, but it does have a happy ending. This is the incredible story of Stephanie Arnold's out-of-body experience. And you can look up Stephanie Arnold online to read more about her. She has gone on to do a lot of great things since her story that I'm going to read you guys. Definitely Google Stephanie Arnold if you want to learn more. Her story has a lot of other elements to it, but there is an out-of-body experience in it, and it's just a very good story. So I hope you guys enjoy. So Stephanie Arnold was pregnant with her second child. and she was very excited. At the beginning of her pregnancy, everything was going well. The baby was healthy. Stephanie felt good. There were no complaints. But when she reached the 20th week of her pregnancy, there were some problems. One day, Stephanie was walking through Tribeca Park in the middle of winter. She had her firstborn daughter in a stroller, and they were discussing the sights and sounds around them. Stephanie remarked about a fountain nearby and how beautiful it was, when all of a sudden, the water in the fountain appeared to turn a bloody red. Stephanie, in shock, grabbed onto the stroller to stabilize herself, and she described what felt like blood hemorrhaging in her body. She worried something was wrong, so she rushed herself to the emergency room, but no hemorrhaging or blood was found. The doctor told Stephanie whatever she felt was a false alarm. But Stephanie felt like this was not a false alarm, but a warning. Just the night before, Stephanie had been sitting at her desk when she had a vision. She said she saw her body lying flat on an operating table. She was cut from her sternum to her pelvis and across the pelvic area in a T shape. And she said she knew in this vision that she was dead. Stephanie was starting to feel like these events were related. Stephanie had recently found out that she had placenta previa, which is a problem during pregnancy when the placenta completely or partially covers the opening of the uterus. The doctor had told Stephanie that the risk of death was pretty low, but still, she felt these visions were like premonitions. One day, when Stephanie was grocery shopping, she went to the baking aisle to grab some flour. She planned to make some bread that night, when all of a sudden she saw what she described as the Sabbath dinner table. The mother's seat was empty. The next day, she had a flashing vision of her burial. She said she lay dead in a shiny, coffee-colored casket and was wearing her husband Jonathan's Air Force dog tags. Next to the casket, Jonathan stood, crying. In his arms was their newborn son, Jacob. Another time, Stephanie was standing in line at a Starbucks coffee shop to get a cup of hot chocolate. The barista was also pregnant, and she asked Stephanie how the pregnancy was going. Stephanie told her she was going to die. All of Stephanie's medical appointments found no concerns. All of her ultrasounds and blood tests appeared normal. So Stephanie started to meet with psychologists and also tried to start figuring out what she needed to do to make sure that someone would be in the operating room that could help save her life when she gave birth. Within 5 weeks, she had gone to every doctor she could think of. The last one that was left to see was the anesthesiologist. So when she sees this anesthesiologist, she asks her what would happen if there were complications and she needed a hysterectomy. The question startled the anesthesiologist, and she was quiet for a while. But after a long pause, they said, "You're in a teaching hospital, and you're in very good hands, and we are aware of your condition, and I hope I made you feel better." This moment was when Stephanie realized no one was going to listen to her, and what was going to happen to her was up to fate. She told the anesthesiologist that day, "It is what it is." She later recalled how alone and frustrated she felt during this time, because no one believed her. Stephanie's husband didn't even believe her. So Stephanie's husband, Jonathan, commuted from their home in Chicago to his office in New York. Most weeknights, Stephanie was home alone with the kids. Because Stephanie had realized it was up to her to save herself, she would stay up late at night and research. After putting the kids to bed, she would also get on Facebook and post things, asking if anyone had her blood type, saying she was going to need it. She even wrote goodbye letters. But every time she started to write a goodbye letter to her husband or her children, she broke down. She couldn't find the right words. 1 week before her C-section, Stephanie walked downstairs to make breakfast. All of a sudden, a rush of blood came out of her and landed on the kitchen floor. Her daughter asked her, "Mommy, why are you peeing red?" Stephanie put on a fake smile and assured her daughter that she was going to have her brother today, and then her daughter was going to meet him. So after strapping her daughter in the car seat, Stephanie drove to the hospital. Healthcare workers hooked her up to some monitors and told her to relax. But all she could think about was what her last words were going to be. Stephanie's doctor came in and told her it was time to deliver. So Stephanie texts her husband and tells him he had made her the happiest woman in the world and told him to please take care of the baby and be a great father like he was. But Jonathan still wasn't getting it. He just asked where he could meet her at the hospital. So Stephanie said, 8th floor recovery, hopefully. The doctor told Stephanie's daughter that she and her new brother would be back to greet her soon. Stephanie kissed her daughter 1,000,000 times. And as soon as the gurney turned the corner, Stephanie broke down crying, knowing she would never see her daughter again. When Stephanie got into the operating room, her arms were strapped to the bed and a curtain was put in front of her face. The doctors began the C-section and they delivered the baby. Then, Stephanie started gagging. Seconds later, she flatlined. The doctors called a code blue. The doctors began to attempt to resuscitate her, bringing in a crash cart with extra monitors and blood. The first attempt to use these supplies was unsuccessful, so a second crash cart was brought in. At this point, Stephanie had been dead for 37 seconds. Finally, the monitor picked up a pulse, and Stephanie was alive again. The doctors put Stephanie into a medically induced coma, and during this time, her placenta previa turned into an accreta, which is a serious pregnancy condition that occurs when the placenta grows too deeply into the uterine wall. Stephanie then started to hemorrhage, and the doctors were forced to give Stephanie a hysterectomy, just like she predicted. Stephanie also started to have secondary complications like kidney failure. On day 6 of Stephanie's medically induced coma, she woke up. She had swelled up to 200 pounds from the kidney failure. So when she woke up, she was confused because the first thing she saw was her big swollen belly, which led her to believe she was still pregnant. This caused her to panic. Had she gone through all of this and not even delivered the baby? But her husband Jonathan was there and whispered in her ear, assuring her she had given birth 6 days ago. This blew Stephanie's mind. So now that Stephanie was stable, she was transferred back to the maternity ward. Jonathan then talked to the head nurse and wheeled their new son, Jacob, into Stephanie's room as a surprise. But this was too emotional and too traumatic for Stephanie. She asked for them to remove Jacob from the room. Stephanie admitted in the Snap Judgment Spooked podcast that at the time, she was scared of Jacob. She could tell that Jonathan was disappointed, but she couldn't help how she felt. So Stephanie visited therapist after therapist to work on her mental health, but no one could explain how she had had these premonitions before her death. A friend eventually suggested hypnotherapy. Jonathan thought this was a bad idea, but Stephanie had to know what had happened in those 37 seconds. She had never been hypnotized before and didn't know if it would work, but she was willing to try anything. The hypnotherapist told her that she could help Stephanie go into a deep meditative state that would help her to know what happened. So Stephanie decides to videotape herself while she's meditating. And Stephanie would later say that the hypnotherapist's voice was familiar to her because it reminded her of her grandmother. So the hypnotherapist began the session by asking Stephanie if she was ready to go into the operating room. Stephanie agreed, mentally taking herself there. The next thing she knew, she was back in the operating room, lying flat on the operating table, arms out and attached to the gurney. The curtain was in front of her face, and she was completely catatonic. The nurses were talking to Stephanie, asking her if she was cold, if she wanted a blanket, that her husband would be there soon, but Stephanie wasn't acknowledging them. When Stephanie was cut open, she then saw what she described as spirit Stephanie, floating perpendicular to her body. The only thing she could hear was the beating of the machine and spirit Stephanie physically tapping on the monitor, counting down, slower and slower and slower, until they were going to take the baby out. The doctors delivered Jacob, and the minute that Jacob was removed, they were delivering the placenta. Stephanie's body then began to seize and convulse. She saw the monitor flatline, and her spirit shot up into the air like a shooting star. A nurse jumped on Stephanie's chest, broke her ribs, and began to give her CPR. The doctor said, "This can't be happening. This can't be happening." When Stephanie's spirit shot up, she saw her grandmother, her Uncle Marvin, people she knew that had passed away. She then heard her uncle say to her, "You always knew what to do. You told the doctors what was going on. You need to go back." This is when Stephanie began to feel physical sensations, such as the scalpel going into her stomach being ripped open, and the umbilical cord being pulled out of her. She also felt like she couldn't breathe. At that moment, the therapist's voice came in and said, "Okay, we're going to come down. We're going to take you past this moment to the moment where you held Jacob for the first time." So then, in the spooked episode, they cut to after the therapy session was over, and Stephanie said to her husband that she really enjoyed the session and she felt relieved after it, that it had relieved a lot of pain. But Jonathan was concerned because he had heard her screaming when the session was happening, because they were doing it downstairs in the living room. So Jonathan finds Stephanie watching the video back, and within watching just a couple of seconds of the video, Jonathan shut the laptop and urged her to stop doing the therapy. He was concerned that it was re-traumatizing her. So Jonathan continued to be very skeptical and asked how she could be sure that what she even saw in this hypnotherapy was real. So Stephanie decided to call one of the anesthesiologists that was in the OR when she died on the table. She asked what it looked like when she went into cardiac arrest. And the anesthesiologist told her it wasn't like a typical cardiac arrest. She said it was like you went into a seizure and you were gagging. Stephanie pulled up the video of her hypnotherapy session, and in the video, she recalls that her eyes rolled back, her chest popped up, and she had a seizure. So when Stephanie gives this description to the anesthesiologist, they confirmed that's exactly what it looked like. Then, the anesthesiologist told her that back when Stephanie was pregnant, that she had said something to the anesthesiologist that would haunt her forever. The anesthesiologist recalled Stephanie saying, "It is what it is." Even though at the time, the anesthesiologist had assured Stephanie and told her not to worry, she took an extra step to be safe. She put a flag on Stephanie Arnold's file. and was sure to have an extra crash cart with extra blood and medical supplies on her delivery day just in case. Stephanie and the doctors believe this was the only reason that she survived. As Stephanie came to terms with what happened, she could tell her husband was pinning his emotions up inside. She would try to talk to him about what happened, but he would shut down and continue to assure her that he was fine, that he had moved on, and he was just glad she was okay. But she knew this wasn't true. And one day, when she was tidying up Jonathan's desk, she found a small paperback prayer book, a version of the Torah. Inside was a folded piece of paper with numbers on it. Stephanie's husband was an economist, and while Stephanie was in a coma, Jonathan was calculating how many amniotic fluid aneurysms happen in a year, how many were fatal, what were the chances of survival, and then she found a letter that he had written. The letter read, "My only love of my life, I am sitting here in the still of the night, listening to the machines beep around you. You look like an angel, which devastates me. What am I to do if you're gone? How will I ever reconcile this to our children, to myself? I should have listened more. I should have been there, if for nothing else but to hold your hand. I should have prayed for you. Rabbi told me this is a test of faith. If I was being tested, why isn't this happening directly to me? Why to you? What did all of this mean? How did you know? I can't lose you. I'd be a shell of a man if you died. Please don't die. I don't." And then he stopped mid-sentence. So later that day, Jonathan came home and went upstairs and watched TV. So Stephanie came upstairs and told him she found the letter. At first, he brushed it off and continued to watch TV. So she decided to maybe communicate with him through a text message instead, so that he wouldn't have to talk to her face to face about it. And she asked him, "Do you believe that I could see dead people?" And Jonathan responded, "Yes." She then said, "One more question. Do you believe me?" And with tears rolling down his face, Jonathan said, "Yes." And that is the story of Stephanie Arnold's death, her miraculous recovery, and her out-of-body experience. Wow. Such an emotional and crazy story. I love the detail of everything that she saw and how it just perfectly matched up with what the anesthesiologist saw. And I believe in science. So I struggle because then there's things like this that you can't really explain. And granted, there are a lot of things about the brain that we still don't know and don't understand, but how can you see above yourself? How can you, in a lot of out-of-body experiences, they hear conversations in other rooms that they find out later were those exact conversations. How do you explain that? I don't know. What I do know is that these stories are very perplexing. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you did, share the link with a few of your friends, family, share it on social media. Be sure to leave a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening on and follow the podcast. If you have any story requests or you want to share a story with me, email me perplexitymysterypodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Instagram, Perplexity Mystery Podcast. Thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know it's a little bit different than what I've done before, but I love neuroscience and psychology, so I do plan to do more stories like this in the future. So let me know what you guys think. I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.